Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you to Free
Go
Mix Radio.
I am Montel and my co-hosts here today are James and Glenn. And today we're going to be talking about World War II history, specifically about the Japanese Empire. You're probably asking yourself, what was the Japanese Empire about? What caused it to happen? What was significant about that event? Today is your lucky day, because we will be answering those questions by breaking them down. Meiji government? Well, the Meiji government began with a clearly set political program, and their goals were reasonably clear. The leadership group was dominated by Satsuma, Shosu, and these court figures who had emerged on the winning side of the battle with the shogun. And they recognized this unified national government was necessary to achieve military, army, and material equality to the West. The important people are Kido Takayoshi and Ido Hirobumi of Chosu and Saigu, Takamari and Okubo Toshimitsu of Satsuma. These men were young samurai of modest standing, but they didn't make an effort to preserve the primacy of the warrior caste, and in fact, the policies that they enacted brought an end to 7 centuries of samurai-dominated society.
The Russo-Japanese War was the war between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire during the year 1904 to 1905. During that war, the Japan Empire won that war, and it was the first Asian power in modern times to defeat European power, and that makes that event significant. On the night of February 8 to 9, without the declaration of war, the main Japanese fleet took the Russian by the surprise at Port Arthur. Because of that impellent loss and blockage of the harbor.
When Adam Stefan Osevich Makarov, a brave and able officer, went to go and take command of the Navy, he took and led to the sea daily and bothered the Japanese fleet. But sadly for the Russian military effort, Makarov was killed in April Fools. The Russian squadron was thereafter kept in the harbor for months, while the Japanese fleet lay off Port Arthur unchallenged. Japan's victory in this war, while not having major geographic or economic effects, saw Japan recognized as a world power in East Asia. Itzo Hirobumi was a Japanese politician who served as the first Prime Minister of Japan from 1885 to 1890. Ido's assassination in 1909 led to Korea's annexation by Japan the following year. Korean liberties and resistance were crushed by 1912 when the Meiji Emperor died. Japan had not only achieved equality by fighting and winning 2 wars with the West, but also had become the strongest imperialist power in East Asia. Alright, Montel, tell us more about Korea.
Japan took over Korea in 1910 mainly because they were concerned about their military strength. In 1910, Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan after years of war, intimidation, and political machinations. The country country would be considered a part of Japan until 1945. In order to establish control over its new protectorate, the Empire of Japan waged an all-out war on Korean culture. After the conclusion of the war, the Japanese leader gained a free hand in Korea. Korean opposition to Japanese reforms was no longer tolerated. Ito Hirobumi was sent to Korea as resident general, forced through treaties that gave Korea little more than protectorate, a state that is controlled and protected by status, and ordered the abdication, renounced the throne of the Korean kings. Ito's assassination in 1909 led to Korea's annexation by Japan the following year. Korean liberators in resistance were crushed. Japan's economic growth was unprecedented. The growth of industrial production and the development of an enormous domestic market. Okay, James, please talk about what happened after Meiji died.
By 1912, when the Meiji Emperor died, Japan had not only achieved equality with the West, but also had become the strongest imperialist power in the world. The Japanese Empire had so much power they basically controlled as much territory as any of the great powers in Europe. In the 1920s, Japan had become a constitutional monarchy with a democratically elected parliament. It had a modern military that had won 2 major wars overseas. Japan was an active member of the international community. They also had economic problems, rising threats from the USSR, China, Korea, and the falling diplomatic relations with the United States over racist treatment of Japanese immigrants.
The Japan Empire is all about aiming to free Asia from the Western colonial rule. Military strategies and alliances such as Triple Pact, the singing between the countries, agreeing on the respect of the leadership with Germany and Italy, were also a part of Japan's imperial objectives. Japan chose to invade other nations such as Japan, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, as well as attack the United States, because as an island nation they had limited resources and wanted to be self-sufficient. The expansions of important because they needed to expand for the country's need for goods and resources.
The Industrial Revolution in Europe and the United States had created a wide gap between Japan and the West, leaving the Asian nation behind technologically and militarily. In that period, Japan did not have the power to stand up to the Western nations, and eventually had to sign unequal treaties that forced them to open their ports and cities to foreign merchants. In around 1940, Japan was in French Indochina, while the Americans were freezing Japanese assets in the States and preventing them from buying oil. So Japan is planning to get oil by force. However, the striking south of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies almost provoked the U.S. Army response, but the U.S. Army was wishing for peace.
Japan invaded China twice as Japan seized dominance in Asia. The first war was called the Sino-Japanese War, and it started in 1894 to 1895. Why do they have war? Because in 1894 the war was a conflict between China and Japan that marked the emergence of Japan as a major world power and demonstrated how weak the Chinese Empire was. The war first broke out in Korea, but the Tonghak Rebellion and Chinese government's involvement requested the Korea King. And the war crime they committed is called the Port Arthur Massacre, from murdering over 16,000 Chinese people. Smiley.
The Second Solar War happened in 1937 to 1945. The Second War had broke the conflict of China, so China had fully scaled the expansion of Japanese territory, and it was also known in China as the War of People Resistance against Japanese aggression. The war with the Chinese people was conflict over 20 million people caused casualties, and they had significant repercussion of both nationalist Kuomintang and the Chinese Communistic Party, and the war crimes was second. In the war crimes, the war crimes they committed mass murder, ravaging citizens of China by the Japanese Imperial and China. Okay, James, tell us why Japan attacked America and Britain and China.
It is because they were limited to oil and natural resources, and they started to ambition to displace the United States as a dominant Pacific power. And in the end, Japan surrendered to the United States, even if they had all the power in the East, and probably had a chance to win, even if it was a very little chance. But they knew they might all die and lose, and that is why they surrendered to the Westerners. The nationalism in Japan helped the rise of militarism, as many soldiers in the Japanese army were nationalist, and the central government was influenced by nationalist ideals, which promoted expansionist policies and military aggression in East Asia, and it made them go to war with China and many other neighboring countries in order to dominate the region. Alright, Montel, tell us what happened next.
The next thing that happened was the rise of militarism and nationalism in Japan's early 20th century trajectory was characterized by political and cultural shifts that heralded the rise of nationalism and militarism. These ideologies played a pivotal role in propelling Japan from being relatively insular, ignorant of or uninterested in cultures, ideas, or people outside one's own experience. Japan had an idea that military conquest could solve Japan's economic problems that wouldn't be new, but the hardship to the Great Depression had increased prominence, and the population had grown during the Meiji Restoration to about 65 million in the 1930s. In each year, Japan's problem worsened. The imports of needed foodstuffs increased while Western tariffs limited exports. It was also argued that discrimination was a barrier to Japanese immigration in many places. Alright, Glenn, tell us what happened in 1940.
In around 1940, Japan was in French Indonesia, while the Americans was freezing Japanese exists in the States and preventing them from buying oil. So Japan is planning to get oil by force. However, the striking south of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies almost provoked the U.S. Army response, but the U.S. Army was wishing for peace. Okay, Anguk, explain us what happened at Pearl Harbor.
When the Japanese army attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, during World War II, and they attacked them because the Japanese needed oil. Japan was very limited to oil, so they captured Manchuria to get the resources they needed to fight. Japan also simultaneously attacked Dutch, British, and American holdings in the Indonesian region, quickly conquering large swaths of land and fully engulfing the region into World War II. Guyana, for wasting your time for listening to us talk about already written history.